It's Wednesday, the 9th of November. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Matt Warman, Labour MP Emma Lewell-Buck, John Stevens of the Daily Mirror and John Longworth, formerly of the pro-Brexit campaign Leave Means Leave. He now chairs the Independence Business Network. Today.
It's always sad to lose a colleague, and particularly in these kind of circumstances. You know, these are people with families, etc. So I think there is, nobody takes any glee when these things happen.
Why was Gavin Williamson brought back in? Why is Suella Braverman still in the government? And this is an indication that the Prime Minister is weak. He's in number 10, but he's not really in control.
After just 14 days in the job, Rishi Sunak loses his Cabinet Office Minister over accusations of bullying and intimidation. The Prime Minister faces Keir Starmer at noon. We'll bring you that live, of course.
I'd like to welcome the fake news media, which is back there. Actually, they were hoping for big losses, but that's not happening.
But are things going Donald Trump's way in the US midterm elections?
Certainly when it becomes sexist, racist, over-sexualised.
3,000 abusive tweets are sent to MPs every day, a BBC investigation reveals. Will Twitter's new owner clean things up or make them worse? Let's start with Gavin Williamson. Sacked twice before as a minister, he has now resigned. It happened last night as two investigations are underway into accusations of bullying. Let's have a look at the front page of the Daily Mail. Williamson forced out in cut-your-throat bully row. He denies any wrongdoing. But my opening question to the panel, starting with you, Matt, is what does it say about Rishi Sunak's control of the party?
Well, I think Gavin's made the right call because it had clearly become a distraction. But ultimately, for me, the Prime Minister is someone who has, throughout his time in government, really made the right decisions, whether that is backing people throughout the furlough scheme, all of that stuff. For me, all of this stuff comes back to that judgment question. And I see a huge amount of evidence that that is someone who has got those decisions right.
But what does it say? But my question was, what does it say about his control of the party? As you say, Gavin Williamson resigned. Should he have been sacked?
Well, I'll answer your first question first. You saw, I think, the party resoundingly get behind Rishi in that leadership contest. He still, of course, retains that control because people saw someone who was the right person to do the job.
What does it say about Rishi Sunak's control of the party?
Well, I mean, really, at the start of this week, the Prime Minister said that he had full confidence. He already knew about some of these allegations.
About a complaint against Gavin Williamson.
About the complaints against Gavin. Then, when he resigned yesterday, the Prime Minister said he accepted his resignation with great sadness. What happened to this integrity, professionalism and accountability that the Prime Minister promised? It's absolutely, he's a weak leader. This is absolutely ridiculous. He should have sacked him as soon as he knew about those allegations. And there's another question here is, what does the Prime Minister know and how long has he known about these other allegations and what on earth did he do about it? Because it looks like he did nothing until they became public.
What do you think it says, John, about Rishi Sunak's control of the party? Because it's clear that some of the briefing, some of it out in the open, is from other ministers or former ministers, which makes it harder, doesn't it, for Rishi Sunak to keep control and govern?
Yeah, I think it shows that you have got the warring different sides of the Tory party. Yes, a lot of Tory MPs did back Rishi Sunak, but there were a lot of people who supported Boris Johnson, who supported Liz Truss, who were quite cheesed off that Boris Johnson got kicked out, that Liz Truss got kicked out, and now think, well, hang on a minute, Rishi Sunak can have a bit of that medicine too. And I think it is quite problematic for Rishi Sunak. As Emma said, that first speech he gave as Prime Minister, within minutes of becoming Prime Minister, he said those words about integrity, accountability, professionalism, and then just a few hours later, he hired these ministers. Suella Braverman, he knew that she'd been sacked 6 days previously, and Gavin Williamson, he knew that there was an outstanding bullying complaint against him. And the reason I think this is really tricky for Rishi Sunak is he was meant to be this new broom. People were saying under Liz Truss that the Tories were tired, that after 12 years in power, maybe they deserved to be in opposition. The whole point of Rishi Sunak was he was meant to be there to clean things up, show that things were kind of back on the road again. And we've just had 2 weeks, his first 2 weeks of Prime Minister, rather than a honeymoon, it's 2 weeks of constant scandals about his ministers.
What do you think, John Longworth?
I'm always astonished, really, that there are two sections of society, of public life, show business and politics. Actually, there's not much difference between the two, is there really, these days? Show business and politics, where the normal rules don't seem to apply about behaviour and the way in which people who are employed are dealt with. So I think it runs much deeper than the Prime Minister. I think it's to do with the culture and the way in which the rules are set. I mean, nowhere in business would the behaviour of politicians be tolerated.
We're going to talk a little bit more about the behaviour and some of the abuse, of course, that MPs receive later on in the programme. But let's talk about the midterm elections in the United States. There isn't a full set of results. There may not be for quite a few days or possibly weeks. These are important elections for both parts of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Of course, we're 2 years away from a presidential election. But let's talk to our correspondent in Washington, David Willis. Hello to you. David, there was talk of a red Republican wave. That doesn't seem to have materialised. There seems to be more optimism amongst Democrats there. But why are these elections important in terms of Joe Biden's ability to govern over the next few years?
Well, they're vitally important, Joe. The simple reason being that without the support of his own party in both houses, there's very little by way of legislation that Joe Biden can hope to get through and get on the statute book. What we appear to be confronting or looking at right now is the Republicans retaking control of the lower house, the House of Representatives, but the Senate race is still too close to call. The only seat to change hands in the Senate so far is the one in Pennsylvania, and that has gone to the Democrats. The hoodie-wearing, tattooed John Fetterman trouncing the Trump-endorsed rival Mehmet Oz in that race. So now it all comes down to other swing states such as Georgia, Arizona and Nevada, and it could be quite some time before we know who has the power in the Congress and particularly in the Senate, for the simple reason that the state of Georgia has gone to a runoff, and that's not due to take place for at least another 4 weeks, Joe.
Right, so we could be waiting quite a long time. What about in terms of a sort of potential platform for those wanting to throw their hats into the ring for the presidency?
Well, the very fact that Trump-endorsed candidates have underperformed in many of the races. We talked about Mehmet Oz. He's one example of that, handpicked by Donald Trump, might, some suggest, open the door to other candidates throwing their hat into the ring to compete with Donald Trump for the Republican presidential nomination. Mr. Trump has promised a special announcement, as he puts it, in a week's time, and that's likely to be the formal announcement that he is running for the White House for a third time. But we saw the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, do extremely well tonight. He expanded his lead there in Florida, and he is a favourite, a darling of the conservative sect, if you like. There are a lot of people who would like to see him challenge Donald Trump for the presidency. He's seen as Trump with less of the drama.
David Willis, thank you very much. High bar, I suppose, in that case. Matt Warman, what do you make of the prospect, potentially, of Donald Trump running again?
Well, I think what I really regret in politics, both in the US and the UK, is that assumption that the most divisive campaign is the one that will win. And I think we've had too much of that in British politics, but you look at America and it really is supercharged there. And so I would hope that whoever runs, they would look at these results and think maybe the most divisive candidates are not the most electorally successful, and that could shape their platform.
Emma?
Well, we know that Trump hates losing, doesn't he? So depending on how these results pan out, he may or may not decide to run again for presidential election. I think if he doesn't run again, then that can only be good for Britain and for the rest of the world, because this man is entirely focused on what's good for him. Obviously, we'll have to work with whoever does win the presidential election, but I think it would be better for all of us if he didn't throw his hat in the ring.
What do you think of the prospect of Donald Trump running?
I think his economic policies were extremely good. His presentation left something to be desired. The United States is still the largest economy in the world by far, and it's very important for the UK and for economic prosperity that we have a really competent US president in charge. We haven't got one at the moment.
Right, and would you say that another President Trump, would that actually be competent in that sense? Is that what you're saying?
Well, if he was to actually follow the policies he was following before on the economy, he did a good job.
What do you think?
I think we all know the toxicity that Donald Trump would bring to the race if he does try and become the president again. We've had a taste of it in the last couple of weeks with Ron DeSantis. Last week he was, before Donald Trump loves his nicknames, calling him Ron DeSanctimonious. He's been saying that Ron DeSantis shouldn't put his hat in the ring. If he does, there's some very damaging information that only perhaps his wife knows that Donald Trump is going to be putting into the public domain. We know that he likes to fight messy. We know what happened last time after he lost, and then we had the insurrection in the US Capitol. I don't think it's good for anyone if he decides to run. And I think if he had any self-awareness after seeing these results where his backed candidates didn't do so well, he wouldn't run. But as we know, he doesn't really tend to have much self-awareness, so I think it's probably quite likely he does choose to run.
Well, we'll wait for that big announcement. Let's return to politics here because, of course, on November the 17th, we have that big economic statement. This is the headline in the Daily Mail. All the papers are running with speculative reports of what might or might not be included in this statement. Now, Rishi Sunnak's return of Brown's 50p top rate tax. That's Gordon Brown back in 2010. Of course, you will remember, those who've been following this story, that Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss wanted to cut the top rate of tax from 45p to 40. That was reversed, and now they may be looking at a return of the 50p rate. You were a backer of Trussonomics, as it was called.
Yes.
It was broadly poorly received. Certainly, it seemed by the markets, and much of it reversed that prospectus by Jeremy Hunt when he was appointed Chancellor. What do you think about a return of a higher top rate of tax?
Well, it's not a good signal for the UK in terms of people working hard and having enterprise. But, Trussonomics, or growthonomics, I'd prefer to call it, was really about supply-side changes. That was the really important area, rather than demand.
And you mean supply side, meaning reforms of things like planning or housing or childcare. And, of course, they hadn't actually come through. But otherwise, you still thought the tax-cutting agenda, even though the market seemed to be spooked by unfunded tax cuts, was a good idea.
Well, the market wasn't spooked by it. That was, if we had a lot of time, I'd explain why that was an entirely parallel thing that was leapt on by those people who wanted power. But...
And who were they?
Well, Sunak and cohorts, of course.
Wow.
But the fact of the matter is they didn't handle it very well. But nobody in business asked for the 45p tax rate to be reduced. It was a surprise. What we did want was for corporation tax to be reduced. What we did want was for deregulation to happen, more planning reforms and so on, which would have boosted the economy. We're in a situation now where what we're facing is austerity, which is totally unnecessary.
Matt?
There's a lot of that I disagree with.
What do you disagree with?
Where to start? So look, I think it's obvious that whether it was down to comms or whether it was down to the policy, then the mini budget had consequences that we are going to have to spend some time picking the pieces up to put things back together again. That is going to make Jeremy Hunt's life immensely difficult. But what I do agree with is some of those supply side reforms, whatever you want to call them, are still incredibly necessary. Childcare in particular, something where we know that we need to do better planning. There's a lot of work to do. So I think a lot of those things do need to be done. And that's why the budget coming up needs to be about the package rather than focusing on any one.
But you have just admitted pretty well, haven't you, Matt Warman, that actually Jeremy Hunt's job is going to be, very difficult because of a previous Conservative Prime Minister. We're all going to pay higher taxes, rightly or wrongly, and we're all going to experience spending cuts.
Well, I think in part it's right to acknowledge that the quasi-Kwarteng budget has contributed to the problem, but I think it's also only fair to say, look, you've got to consider what's going on in Ukraine, you've got to consider COVID, all that. There are a range of factors that he has got to address, and denying that is just to deny reality.
But no one was talking about savings or spending cuts on this scale until that mini-budget came along. Liz Truss tried to mortgage the entire country on the back of tax cuts for the rich.
You did actually. Labour did sign up to quite a lot of that tax-cutting agenda, the cut in the basic rate from 20 pence to 19 pence. You were also in favour of reversing the national insurance hikes. I know you never supported it, but you backed that too, and, of course, the energy intervention. So it was only the 45 pence, wasn't it, really?
Well, some bits of that budget were still unravelling as the government unravelled yet again for about the 100th time in the last few years. And ultimately, we were pushing for a windfall tax on energy producers. There's other things that can be done, but this government won't do those things because they don't want to, because it's about values and it's about where you want the burden to fall. And they always want it to fall on working people and ordinary families.
John?
I can't agree with that. I mean, the business. The thing is, I mean, it's like a plague on both your houses, quite frankly. I mean, I oscillate between despair and rage on behalf of the business community, because we have a situation where people who are actually trying to create enterprise, generate the wealth to pay for public services, are just being knocked back completely by this budget. But Labour have no answer to it either. I mean, Labour's slightly better on tax at the moment, amazingly, because they want a 1p reduction in the general rate of taxation and they want to deal with business rates. That's remarkable in itself. But actually, we've got a socialist government now.
Oh,
and
Rishi Sunak's a socialist government, Matt.
And we have a
I think we both disagree, but for different reasons.
And we have a choice.
Well, when you say it's a socialist government, just describe for our viewers what you mean. Why is Rishi Sunak a socialist heading a socialist government?
Because what he's doing is he's hammering business. He's withdrawing from deregulation. He's actually taxing enterprise. He's taxing individuals and taxing work. These are all the sorts of things that you'd normally expect from a Labour government.
I think it's quite hard to buy that. There's an obvious need to balance the books. There's an obvious need to redress some of the costs that we've got to pay. That's not the same thing as looking at what Labour have got, which the only thing we can say with certainty is that it's certainly unfunded. So I think we've got to be honest about
set out how we would pay for the policies we've announced so far. We've set out how we would pay for them. We've said we'd be fiscally responsible. I don't see how
it's very easy. It's very easy to say you're going to be fiscally responsible. Demonstrating it is a different thing.
Well, we demonstrated when we were last in government.
Demonstrating
we grew the economy and kept taxes low. That's something that the past 12 years of Tory governments have failed to do. Spectacularly failed to do.
We can maybe discuss the history another time. But what I do think is true is demonstrating fiscal responsibility is what Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak are doing right now through that package that does seek to do some of the deregulatory stuff that we've talked about before, but also does seek to put some of those taxes back in.
Well, just briefly, would you back raising the higher rate of income tax to 50p?
Well, my gut instinct is no, but what I would say is that it all comes down to what that package is in the round.
All right, well, your gut says no. What does your gut say about a higher rate of tax to 50 pence, as was under Gordon Brown?
I'd say is yes. It's nice to see the Tories borrowing our policies again.
Ah, well, there you go. On which one is more socialist, do you think, John, in terms of Labour's policies or Rishi Sunak?
I think let's see what actually ends up in the budget. We obviously know that these policies are often floated and sometimes don't end up in there. But you look at the two tax rises that have been floated today. One is that one on the higher rate of income tax. One is on council tax, suggesting that they'd get rid of the cap, which means that bills can only go up by a certain amount a year without a local referendum. both of those things were things that were promised in the Tory manifesto that they wouldn't do. And Rishi Sunak's whole argument when he came in as Prime Minister for why there shouldn't be a general election was because he was following the mandate of the 2019 manifesto. And I think if you just see him slashing through the promises in that manifesto and doing whatever he feels he wants to, you're just going to see louder and louder calls for a general election.
John?
Yeah, I agree with that, actually. There will be louder calls for a general election. The idea that there's actually a fiscal black hole is a construct. The fact of the matter is...
Well, when you say it's a construct, I mean, listening to, either whether it's politicians on either side, they do agree there is a black hole in the finances that has been made worse to some extent. This is according to them, made worse. These are the people that are going to have to come up with the budget, and Labour is no doubt going to scrutinise it as a result of the Kwasi and Liz Truss measures. Now, we will see how big that so-called black hole is, as you call it, on the 17th of November. But to say it's a construct...
No, it is a construct, because the fact of the matter is, had we had growth in the economy, there would have been no need to fill a black hole, because it would have been self-filling.
But there hasn't been growth.
They have created a black hole. They have created a black hole because it was politically convenient to do so. And if you've actually got this so-called black hole, bearing in mind that we have the second lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7. The United States and others have much higher debt ratios.
Are you really saying that the OBR, when they come forward with their forecast next week, are just going to be coming up with these figures just willy-nilly based on their own political prejudices?
No, what I'm saying is that the OBR will identify that there is a shortfall for public spending. If you're going to balance the books within... No, hold on. If you're going to balance the books within 1 year. But if you're looking at the longer term, actually, the debt could have been paid down perfectly well without having to take these measures.
Emma? Did you want to respond? I mean,
no, I think I've said what I
it's interesting that the black hole is politically convenient for anybody. That doesn't feel like the reality we're living in.
And I think most people have thought that actually that was the reason the markets spooked, because they didn't trust that it would be paid back. But
and there are plenty of economists who also disagree with it.
Yeah, all right, that's true. Economists and experts, they've been out of fashion for a while. Let's have a look at this video. Now, for those of you who can't remember, that was Rishi Sunak's campaign video as part of his leadership bid. It was about shredding or getting rid of some or all of EU laws. But this is today's headline in the Financial Times. UK plan to scrap all EU laws, suffers new setback. So, looks like the bonfire isn't going to happen, John. Is that disappointing?
If it doesn't happen, it will be hugely disappointing for the 85% of businesses in the UK who are family-owned or run, because it's those businesses that are the backbone of the economy that actually generate enterprise and innovation, and it's those businesses that are drowning in red tape. Big businesses quite like it, of course, because it's a barrier to entry, and it's actually a means of competing.
Will you be disappointed if it doesn't happen?
Look, I was one of the few Labour MPs who voted for the Brexit deal because I believed we should get through the gridlock and make progress. But what this bill is going to do is going to have ministers deciding what should be converted, what should be retained, what should be got rid of. And that is not democratic. That is far from taking back any control whatsoever. That's people in back rooms making decisions about people's employment rights, environmental standards, food standards, animal rights. I think these should have proper consideration on the floor of the House of Commons with MPs, with trade unions, with industry, with everybody involved. It shouldn't be just a mass deregulation behind closed doors. That's very dangerous and very reckless. And considering that a couple more thousand of them have been found now as well, just this week, I think 1,400 more that the government didn't even know existed, I definitely don't trust them behind closed doors to do any of this.
John?
I think the 1,400 was actually a set of moribund regulations that have simply been dragged up, as another weapon
You know
to
the
actually
detail
stop
of
it
every
happening.
single one of them? Because they will impact on people's lives.
Well, I have a very good idea of what the sort of regulations all these things are. And there is a thing called the Regulatory Policy Committee, I happen to know because I sit on it, that actually does the cost-benefit analysis of every single legislative proposal that goes through Parliament.
Right,
so
but what
there is scrutiny.
Yeah, but what people will want to know is what regulations are you talking about? Give us some specific examples of these dreadful regulations, this red tape that you want to get rid of.
Well, there's all sorts of bureaucratic stuff. For example, the Ergonomics Directive, which required businesses to do a checklist exercise each year of the ergonomics in a office environment. You know, the problem with regulation is that they're all little things that cumulatively add up.
Right, you could get rid of that, couldn't you?
That causes huge...
Well, this is the thing. We're talking about thousands of pieces of legislation here. It needs to be considered properly, openly, on the floor of the House of Commons.
So if you were going down a list, would you get rid of the Natalie called ergonomics, whatever it is, regulation for people's office space? Would you get rid of that?
I mean, I don't know enough about that, to be perfectly honest. It's a bit obscure, but what I do know about is some of these laws relate to holiday leave, maternity leave, people's rights at work. They're important. They should not be left to the Tories to decide behind closed doors.
But we had all of those things before we joined the EU. And I mean, are we actually saying...
Not what they are now. They weren't before we joined the EU.
Are we actually saying... But we would have had the sort of legislation for those sorts of areas.
Could have. I'm talking about reality.
There's obviously a bureaucratic burden of having to follow different laws for businesses. There's also a bureaucratic burden on the other side. If you suddenly start junking stuff en masse, and there's laws there that don't really make much of a difference to how our countries run and whether business is successful or not, if loads of small firms are suddenly having all these rules changed and have to get used to them, that is a bureaucratic burden on businesses.
But you see, that's always the excuse for not actually removing the burden on business. The fact of the matter is that there's so much legislation that most business owners don't even know what half of it is and can't comply with it anyway.
But is it responsible to
end up being in trouble?
But is it responsible, though, to get rid of the whole lot in one go without knowing?
That's not what they're doing.
Right.
I mean, what they're doing is they're going to transpose it into UK law and review it. It is not junking vast amounts of legislation.
Ministers decide what will be scrapped, not Parliament. Ministers decide what's going to be scrapped. That's not democratic.
Parliament will scrutinise it in the end because it will go to the committee.
What I find odd is the complaint that UK elected and appointed ministers are somehow less able to do this than their European counterparts. This is about this is a fundamental tenet of that Brexit conversation. It's about the UK having the nimbleness and the agility to make its own decisions and doing it in the right way. And the idea that, for instance, we might make changes to maternity laws without them coming under the scrutiny of the House of Parliament is plainly absurd. Of course, that stuff will get the scrutiny that it requires. And the assumption that the UK government would want to make those rights less than they are now simply isn't borne out by the evidence of a Conservative government.
You've also got to take into account how these laws were made in the first place. I mean, I was a member of the European Parliament. I sat there and saw it happening. You go into the Parliament, the technocrats would present 150 pieces of legislation in about 2 hours, and all that would happen is the parties would rubber stamp them. They press the button or put their hands up.
Rehashing the old debates around Brexit again. We need to move forward.
But
we need to look
scrutiny.
sensibly at the changes that are going to be made to this legislation.
There was no democratic
Instead of going back to the
scrutiny.
old debate, let's look at what's happening in the future.
It's very important to understand there was no democratic scrutiny of the introduction of these things in the first place. It was a technocratic decision, and a lot of European regulation is actually made by committees.
As an MEP?
But the MEPs were written out of the script. That's the point I'm making.
I mean, Emma does make a reasonable point, right, which is that lots of these changes are going to be things that the government will want to do in the interests of promoting workers' rights or business or whatever. And those are, and scrutinising those is the right thing to do. What we shouldn't do, though, is pretend that we have ever lived in a country where every single one of the most minor resolutions was not made through delegated powers. They always have been. The scaremongering around some of this is unnecessary. unnecessary, and it is an attempt to rehash the European debate.
But the bill gives ministers power to do this behind closed doors. That's the reality of it. You can sit there and say they're not going to do that, but the bill gives them the powers to do that.
All right, we're going to move on because we're going to talk, as we said in the headlines, about the online abuse, sadly, that MPs suffer. A new BBC investigation has been carried out into the abuse. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth. What has the investigation found, Alex?
You will know, and I suspect most of the panel will know, that this phenomenon of abuse that MPs get online is no new thing. But this is a piece of work that's been done by the BBC's Shared Data Unit. And what they did was they looked at 3 million tweets which were aimed at MPs during a 6-week period in the spring. They then used an online tool which was developed by a research unit that's funded by Google to analyse those tweets and rate them on a level of toxicity. So using things like the words that appear, offensive language, how likely they might be to make someone want to leave a conversation. And what it found was around 1 in 20 were deemed to be toxic. Women were marginally more likely to be subject to this kind of abuse than men. Women were more likely to be subject to sexualised language, more likely to be called ignorant or thick. Men were more likely to be called liars. And of course, what all this does, Joe, is raise the questions which have been debated before, but remain no less relevant, about what this does to political discourse, what this does to the state of our democracy. Because you speak to some MPs and they say, when you're getting this level of abuse, which goes beyond the normal rough and tumble or scrutiny that people expect within political debate, what it can do is put them off wanting to weigh in on controversial subjects, sometimes the topics that actually deserve the best level of debate, and potentially, as we've heard before, put some people off getting into politics altogether. So there's a serious conversation about the ramifications of the kind of abuse that this study shows is still very prevalent.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's only when you see the sort of scale and the numbers that it really brings it home when you think on a daily basis. I mean, what might be the sort of consequences or outcomes of this investigation in terms of going ahead with policy?
We're talking to a couple of MPs on and off the record, and some people say to me that if they know they're going to get a huge amount of backlash, they'll be reluctant to state their position on a certain issue. They might even reconsider their position on a certain issue. Jess Phillips said that she knows of people who have been in that position, and while she's been very vocal on Twitter and says she wants to continue to be, it does make her think a little bit about it. The MP Flick Drummond, Conservative MP, she's come off Twitter altogether, but says again it makes her think twice before she weighs in or voices an opinion on certain subjects. And more broadly, we spoke to the political think tank Demos, and they say there is a concern that it's putting people off standing. It's a concern that it's putting people off or changing the way that people think about policy. And the other point to bear in mind, that often that this is a vocal minority on Twitter. So this is 1 in 20 of the tweets that we examined over this period is deemed to be toxic. That obviously means 19 out of 20 aren't. But sometimes that vocal minority is having a disproportionate effect on public debate because of the impact it's having on MPs who are receiving this kind of thing.
Alex Forsyth, thank you very much. Emma, unfortunately, you appear relatively high or up on the list in terms of the amount of abuse you receive. What sort of thing are we talking about here without being too graphic?
Well, I'm a working class woman with an accent for one, so I get a lot of that thrown at us. I get a lot about my appearance. But I think for me, it can be really terrifying. So from my previous job, I've had people contact me on private message on Facebook. So I've been sat alone at night thinking, oh, I'll check through my messages. And there's been people there threatening to shoot me, and there's been a big thread about how they could go about that. And these are people who I know can actually carry that out. Now, that's absolutely terrifying. There needs to be some controls put in place. The online harms bill has been delayed now since 2018. We need some action on this. And none of my friends or family actually follow me online because they can't bear to see some of the abuse that I get. They find that so upsetting.
No, I'm sure.
I withdraw from it. It would never stop me from having my views or seeing what I think. No, nothing ever would. But I ignore a lot of it. I put out what I put out, and then I ignore and I don't get involved in the debate. And like I said, my friends and family and people close to me have all blocked us because, one, it protects them from these people, but also it stops them from seeing things that'll upset them about me.
Matt, what about your experiences?
Yeah, I think it is regrettably factually true that it is women who bear the brunt of it far more than men. But nonetheless, I've had incidents where I said I was going to be doing a surgery and a constituent advised me to bring a stab vest. It's sort of those sorts of threats are just routine. And the irony is that the police also know that they are routine. They know that a tiny fraction of them are made by people who could carry them out. And that makes their job infinitely harder because sorting the wheat from the chaff is almost impossible.
Ever thought of quitting Twitter?
No, but I have questioned what the point is. I think if I hadn't been on it in the first place, I'm not sure I'd join it.
I won't quit it because I think it's important for some of my constituents to get the message out there. But the minute I'm no longer doing this job, I would shut down all my social media accounts straight away.
What's your response, listening to what MPs experience on a daily basis in terms of the future of, yes, political discourse, but also putting people off perhaps going into politics?
Yeah, I mean, it's really horrible, of course. It's difficult to know. I mean, first of all, people should not be allowed to be anonymous on Twitter, in my view. So it should be that anybody who's making a comment, you actually know who they are, which will actually reduce the likelihood of them being horrific in the first place. But you know, I don't read the responses to what I put on Twitter. That's my policy. It's the best thing because then I don't know how nasty people are. But you know, I've had my home attacked. We've had offices that we use attacked over the months and years. It happens to a lot of people in public life. It's sort of grist to the mill, really, but it's not nice.
John?
I think the worrying thing when you look at the report, and it's awful what all of you have shared about your own personal experiences, is that a lot of MPs feel they can't take part in certain debates because of this. You look at the figures in the report when people have had spikes of abuse against them. There was the case of James Murray, who's a Labour frontbencher. He did an interview on the radio talking about trans rights, and then he got hundreds of toxic replies to that. There's another example, Deanna Davison, a Tory MP. She had written an open letter to Will Smith after he punched that guy at the Oscars?
Yes.
I forget. And then she got loads of abuse messages after that. Both those people were just doing their jobs. James Murray is a Labour politician. He's meant to go out on shows like this, give his opinion on different topics. It is for MPs to write open letters, get involved in debates like this. And if they feel they aren't able to do that, that's really worrying. And we want the best people to be MPs. We don't just want those people with super thick skin who would be able to tolerate this.
Well, let me just show you this headline in the Times, because I suppose the question, Matt, you were formerly a tech journalist, is whether Elon Musk, the new owner of Twitter, will clean things up. The headline actually says Elon Musk's team asking some sacked Twitter staff to return. Obviously, he is now in control of the social media platform. He promptly sacked 4,000 staff, nearly 4,000 staff, and has now asked very quickly for some of them to come back. Do you think he'll clean it up or it'll be more Wild West?
Well, I think what he's talked about before would indicate that it will be less regulated and more, he would say, free. I think I'd probably agree with your more Wild West term. But actually what this underlines is this isn't just a debate about politicians. This is a debate about the broader toxicity of social media. You don't have to be in public life to have a really terrible experience. And that's why I think